Jesus freak here. Every so often, I wind up bringing up the topic of ancient Bible translations, of which I'm familiar in varying degrees with two of them, and vaguely familiar with others. The main ones I deal with are the Septuagint and the Vulgate. Now, the Vulgate was revolutionary in its day because the translator who worked on the Old Testament said he wasn't going to translate from the standard text of the time, but was going to go back to the source. You could say he was the William Tyndale of his day. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to make the impact he really wanted. The Church of Rome continued to this day to treat several extra books that appeared in the Greek text of the time as theopneustos. Some people outright rejected his translation because they thought that whole Greek translation was theopneustos, was inspired by God. They had this idea, there was a myth, and I'm not sure when that myth happened, but that's where the name Septuagint comes from. There was a myth that authorities in Egypt managed to find 6 people from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, sequester them all, and have them translate the first 5 books of the Bible into Greek. And the legend says that all 72 of them provided the exact same translation, word for word and letter for letter. And as such, you got this meme going around in certain circles, mostly Christian, because at that point the Jews had rejected this idea and gone back to Hebrew. That this translation and the other translations associated, which also became known as the Septuagint, was divinely inspired. And Jerome disagreed and translated the entire Old Testament from the original languages. And he got some flack for it. Over time, actually, older Latin translations occasionally, some of the language used in them seeped into copies of his translations. The Church of Rome rejected his Hebrew-based translation of the Psalms, preferring one that was translated from Greek. Both have been preserved, both still exist. Now, a lot of people these days cast aspersions on Jerome's translation because it was the official translation of the Church of Rome for about 1,500 years. Apart from the fact that, yeah, it does include the Apocrypha, for what it is, it's not bad. You have to keep in mind its limitations. It was a one-man job, and it has problems. There are passages where things are just not translated right. And I don't necessarily mean that it's necessarily, mistranslation of the sort where someone got something wrong because they didn't understand what they were reading. But there's places where something was translated too literally. For example, the second half of Isaiah 5:1. If you were to translate the Latin reading directly into English, you'd have, "A vineyard is made to my beloved and Horn the son of oil." Which, yes, that is what the Hebrew says, but that's not what it means. And sometimes this does happen. The Latin text is definitely based on manuscripts that were very similar to the Masoretic text. There's not too many differences. There are a couple. For example, when Cain talks to Abel right before he kills him in Genesis 4, I think, maybe it was 5. In the Masoretic text, he doesn't say it doesn't say what he said to him. And the Vulgate has him saying, "Let's take this outside." And almost all the other ancient translations agree with the Vulgate against the Masoretic text. So it's possible, something dropped out of the Masoretic text after that period, during the roughly, 400, 500 years between the time the Vulgate translation was done and the time the Masoretic text was stabilized. But a lot of other quirks of the Masoretic text are in the Vulgate too, like when in 1 Samuel, I think it's 13:1, that's introduced saying that Saul was the child of a year when he began reigning and reigned 2 years over Israel or something like that. And that's what the Hebrew says, and that's what the Vulgate says. So it's accurately translating the Hebrew, warts and all. And that's where it seems to be useful. If you understand the limitations of dealing with the fact that you're translating from a Semitic language into basically the progenitor of every Romance language that we now have. They're very different languages. They work in very different ways. Hebrew, you run into a lot of expressions in Hebrew. It's going to sound like Darmok and Jalad at Tanagra. You can't understand it without context. And Latin is a very clear, precise language. But if you keep in mind the limitations, you keep in mind what the Vulgate was, It was basically the KJV of its day. It's not a bad translation. There are things that could be improved, but it's not a bad translation. I sometimes rely on it. And it's interesting to look at. There are a lot of places where, the King James translation clearly owes something to the Vulgate. I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. With the state of the knowledge of Hebrew in the 16th and 17th centuries, it's no surprise that occasionally they had to look to Latin for some help. We've learned more since then. I'm not knocking the KJV translators. I don't see the KJV as perfection or some platinum iridium standard. I don't see the Vulgate the same way either. I just my sticking with the KJV has nothing to do with that. It's more, cultural than anything. But I could go on about that. Jesus freak out.